Tonight we're here to talk about the response, to talk about religious freedom, to talk about issues of marriage and free speech. But we're also here to celebrate one of the most important accomplishments of this past legislative session and sessions for quite some time, and that's the Pastor Protection Law. And some of the people that are not here with us tonight that were a part of making this law come about were Governor Greg Abbott, who tweeted, if y'all might remember that, his support for the Pastor Protection Law. It's interesting how technology works this day, but even the governor is involved in social media and very active and has shown his support for the Pastor Protection Law when it was a bill and then became into law. Also, we want to acknowledge the efforts of Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who made sure that a bill was introduced in the Senate when things were starting to slow down on the House side. And in addition to that, we want to acknowledge Senator Craig Estes, who is the Senate author of the Pastor Protection Law, Senate Bill 2065. And so we're here to celebrate because it's no easy task, as you might imagine, to get a piece of legislation passed, and particularly a very important legislation like this that ties together the issues of religious freedom in marriage so well, that was timely, that was a part of something that was happening across the country, not just in Texas, but one of the defining issues of the first half of this year and for many years leading up to this point. We have a special message from our Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, who could not be here with us, but wanted to make sure that you heard from him regarding his support and how important this issue is to them. And we do have a video that we're going to play.
Hello, friends. I'm Dan Patrick. Proud to be your Lieutenant Governor. I wish I could be with you in person for this very important event, but unfortunately scheduling conflicts prevent me from doing so. First, let me thank each of you for attending this event and for showing your support for marriage and religious freedom. The leaders speaking to you today, including my good friend, Representative Scott Sanford, are beacons of faith and liberty, and I'm proud to serve with them. As you know, traditional marriage is under attack in America and under attack by 5 Supreme Court justices. Their overreaching decision is a threat to our fundamental religious beliefs, and that's why in the Texas Senate, we fought to pass the Pastor Protection Act. It is a new law that prevents any religious organization or member of the clergy from being required to perform or provide gay marriage services that violate their sincerely held beliefs. We also sent the strongest message possible to the court justices by overwhelmingly approving a Senate resolution memorializing our belief that marriage is and should always be only between a man and a woman. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court majority didn't listen. And now 5 unelected attorneys, as Justice Scalia called them, have decided gay marriage is a constitutional right. It is a concept that I and a large majority of Texans strongly disagree with. Our work is never easy, and there are many challenges that lie ahead for all of us. As a Christian first and foremost, I stand with you in your faith and prayer, and in our mutual conviction that no one, especially our religious and business leaders, should ever be compelled to do anything that separates us from the very fundamental principles of our faith. I look forward to working with each of you on this fundamental issue, and I pray God bless you, your families, our great country, and the greatest state of all, Texas.
Round of applause for Lieutenant Governor Patrick. I also want to thank other organizations you're going to hear from tonight: Texas Pastor Council, Liberty Institute, Concerned Women for America. So key in this legislation and this law coming about, and I can't say enough about their leadership on this issue and their commitment. Just a little bit about myself, if you will, since we're in Collin County. Many years ago, I had the pleasure of working for Liberty Institute, which many of y'all know is a religious liberty law firm and nonprofit organization in the Plano area in Collin County. And I remember those times working here and getting the benefit from working under the leadership of Kelly Shackelford and Hiram Sasser and Jeff Mateer and so many of their folks. And so it's great to be back with you in Collin County, where I had an opportunity as a young lawyer to start becoming involved in these issues and getting a very clear sense of what it means to fight for faith, family, and freedom. I do like to say, as I am a 5th generation Texan, and I'm very proud of the work that I've been blessed to do as a Christian And there's a reason why the name of our organization is called Texas Values, because those are the values that we believe in: faith, family, and freedom. And those are the values that always have and always will make Texas great. You know, Proverbs 18:17 tells us that he who presents his case first seems right until someone steps forth to challenge. Now, just a month or so ago, a handful of unelected federal judges at the Supreme Court gave their opinion about what the issue of marriage is and how it should be defined, and even touched on the issue of religious freedom. But now it's our turn to talk about how we respond. And you know, as a matter of fact, the state of Texas, being the leader that it is, started before the Supreme Court ruled. This law actually was passed, the Pastor Protection Law, was passed before the Supreme Court even ruled, because there was strong concern about this issue. And as a matter of fact, because there was such overwhelming support, the law went to immediate effect before the Supreme Court was able to rule on this issue. And you saw that our elected officials at the top, all the way in our House and Senate, have gotten involved in this issue in support of it. Now, you know, it's interesting because when the Pastor Protection Law was being talked about and discussed, there was a lot of opposition. You see people now saying, oh, we're supportive of that, or we think this is a good idea. From the beginning, this law was targeted as one of the most important religious freedom and marriage issues, because there was a concern about the freedom that you would have, that churches would have, that employees would have on this issue, particularly before the Supreme Court ruled. You had the ACLU. You had even some church denominations that were Christian. You had a group called the Texas Freedom Network. All of them lining up time and again to oppose this legislation every step of the way, writing op-ed articles and opinion articles and different things in the paper to try to mislead people about this issue. You even had one person writing in the Huffington Post essentially begging the head of Apple to either boycott or to withdraw his support, or I guess leave the state of Texas if a law like this was passed. Well, I think we came out on the winning side of that issue. I don't know about you. So we're excited to talk about that. So before we get into some of the specifics of the law, I wanted just a couple of housekeeping measures. We have a really nice book that we have that's going to be available in the back tables at the end, and we're going to do a drawing later. So if you've not signed up on our sign-up sheet, we encourage you to do that. This is a book called Truth Overruled: The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom by Ryan Anderson, one of the most dynamic and important voices on religious freedom and marriage in our country, and is frequently on national news, and has written a book before this on this issue, and this is some updated information. In addition to that, we have a handout, if you haven't gotten it yet, that walks you through what we're about to talk about on the Pastor Protection Law. So I encourage you to get that information as well. In addition, we've got a nice legislative guide. We're not here today just to talk to you about the issue and for you to be informed on it. We want you to feel equipped and empowered to do something about it when you leave here today. And the best way you can do that is with the Texas Legislative Guide, which you can get a copy of at the front. So let's talk about the Texas Pastor Protection Law. And we've got a slideshow that I want to walk you through because I want you to be informed. You know, when you pass laws in the state of Texas, at least I would think, hopefully people actually read the law as opposed to other places. So now it is interesting because when you look at this law, it's titled the Texas Pastor Protection Law. And that certainly was a way for us to give people an idea of what it's about. But if you look at the law, you can see on the screen, it is more than just about pastors. When we talk about religious freedom and marriage, we know that having protections in place have to go far beyond the four walls of the church. But we should not minimize that. We should not think for a second that these walls are impenetrable. There are people every day writing articles, discussing these issues, that would like to see that change. And that's one of the reasons, the many reasons why this idea came about by Representative Scott Sanford, the House author of the law, who you're going to hear from in just a minute. We had people in Houston, as you know, pastors who had their sermons subpoenaed. That should have been off limits, right? The First Amendment protects that a government official can't go into the church and the pulpit and demand to see the sermons of the pastors. And I'm sure those pastors would have given them over. They thought they could have given, been good benefit to this elected official, but it was the fact that the government was doing it under subpoena, under the threat of penalty. You even had the top government lawyer when the same-sex marriage case was argued, talking about whether or not tax exemption of some religious entities would be in question. And if there was a support there from that entity of marriage between one man and one woman. In addition to that, since the Supreme Court has ruled, you've had ACLU say they're withdrawing their support from religious freedom laws that have been on the books for decades, that they were a part of supporting. And we know from the testimonies of pastors, many of who you're going to hear from today, the calls and the demands they've been getting before the Supreme Court ruled to violate their beliefs on their marriage and to have their sanctuary used for something that goes against their beliefs. So the pastor protection law protects not only pastors, clergy, churches, but also religious organizations. And that's a word that's used in the law, and that's currently in our state law. You can't be forced to solemnize, form, or celebrate a marriage that violates your religious belief. That issue of form is becoming very important because right now we have a state law in place that allows nonprofits like churches and pastors to be a part of premarital counseling. How many of y'all have heard of that? Maybe you're involved in that in your church. So we have a law where you can waive the marriage license fee if you get involved in premarital counseling. That's a way the state encourages people to get more equipped before they get married. So hopefully if there are any concerns that come up, they're able to figure those out and to get some guidance. Now there are some people that are already saying, well, wait a minute, churches and pastors shouldn't be involved in this issue if they don't agree with marriage as it's been redefined. If they want to define it as just between a man and a woman, then they should not be able to be a part of this program. But you see the word there talks about forming marriage. So it's covered there. Property, facilities, goods, services, the church organizations. We talked about this, Representative Sanford talked about this during the testimony. That includes hospitals. Many religious hospitals actually have a chapel in them. Many of y'all may be familiar with that. That wouldn't be a surprise though, probably. People going through difficult times would pray. But as a matter of fact, sometimes people at the hospital decide they want to get married. So it's very important to have that protection in place. In addition to campgrounds, many religious organizations and church entities will have other property where they do camps and they do other events, and we want to make sure that those are protected as well, and they are in this law. Employees of the religious organization. We've already seen this come up in the state of Texas regarding piano players, regarding choralists, regarding people that are on staff. In addition to that, the law talks about people that are actually supervised or controlled by the church entity and the religious organization as well. So it's important too, if you look towards the end, one of the last section you see on this slide, no civil or criminal action by the state or local government can be used to penalize or withhold benefits or privileges, including tax exemptions, in response to religious-based marriage decisions by the protected groups and individuals. And if you're starting to think about questions, we're going to have a question and answer session towards the end. So just be prepared. You want to write those down. We'll be happy to address those. So we've seen time and again these issues come up, not only in the state of Texas, but in other parts of the country. So that's why this law goes beyond just protecting the pastor and just protecting clergy and churches. Religious organization is not defined and limited in that way in the state of Texas. So if you'll go to the next slide, on our frequently asked questions section, you'll see some of the questions that people ask us. What impact does the U.S. Supreme Court case on marriage ruling have on this law? Well, the Supreme Court ruling should have no impact on this law. This is a state law. It should operate the same. And if anything, our view is it'll prove even more helpful regarding the specific rights of churches and religious organizations and employees on this issue. That is one of the main reasons why this law was passed. Because what we were hearing from pastors and churches and employees, churches, that having that specific protection in law leaves no doubt. How many of y'all, if you're a leader of a church, because I've heard about this several times, where you'll get a letter in the mail from the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, or some other entity, trying to convince you that something that you're doing from the stage, from the pulpit, just educating people about elections or things of that nature, that somehow you're violating the law. We get those calls all the time. And why is that? Because some people think there's some gray area in the law. That's why it was very clear when it comes to this law to make sure that it was very specific what the protection was about when it comes to this issue. So when we see the Supreme Court rule, that did not take away the right of states like Texas to have religious freedom protection in law when it comes to religious organizations, churches, pastors, and clergy. Now, you've seen articles written even though since then, suggesting that if a church does not recognize same-sex marriage, that they should lose their tax-exempt status. And we were told that argument was that didn't exist before this law was passed, before the Supreme Court ruled. Oh, that wasn't something to worry about. You know, the First Amendment covers that. Well, now we've left no doubt in the law that the Supreme Court covers this issue. So one of the questions that's asked, does the law just protect pastors? And we've covered that, right? But people will ask that. Ministers, employees, while acting in the scope of that employment, are protected. So going to the next slide, can my church follow the biblical definition of marriage? Decision related to formation, solemnization, and celebration of marriage. Yes, that's very clear. It should be very clear in this law that that's what it protects. But we want to make sure people know that, because you think about this issue, it's not just about performing the marriage, it's about whether or not your facilities are going to be used maybe to celebrate. Maybe they want to have a reception after the marriage that goes against the church's beliefs is after it's performed. They just want to use, part of your facility for that. And Kelly Shackford is going to talk a little bit more in detail about the importance of having policies in place regarding a church and a pastor for religious liberty purposes. But just know that you oftentimes will be asked to do something not just in regards to a marriage, but in regards to other facilities. I've already been getting calls at our office about that and questions about that for off-site services. Even one particularly for organizations that are affiliated with the particular denomination, but maybe have some separate property somewhere. The next one, which we covered earlier in the law, is whether or not benefits can be withheld. You're going to hear a lot more about that. Denial of government contracts. That's what I was talking about, this premarital program. Somehow to try to penalize you from any type of tax benefit or some tax consequences related to the state level government as well, in relation to any exemptions that you might be able to claim at the state level regarding things. I know as an organization for us, that's something we do oftentimes with mail. We're able to claim an exemption on that issue. And so, but you're going to see that a lot. And why? Because faith-based organizations are very much involved in trying to promote and preserve the welfare of the people in our state. One of the things that we talked about during the session, and Representative Sanford was a part of, was having legislation in place that protects foster care providers and adoption care providers. They typically contract, if you will, with the state to cover a service that the state cannot cover themselves. I think that a large portion, 25% of the foster care and adoption agencies are faith-based in the state of Texas. And the statistic I heard was for the premarital education program, 2/3 of the providers for that program are faith-based and religious-based. So it's important to know that that language is in there if people ask you a question about that and have a concern. And lastly, does the law ban churches from performing same-sex marriage? Well, it does not. And that's how this issue has to work. So if a church wants to do that, this law does not prevent them from doing that, does not get in the way from doing that, and does not try to overrule the Supreme Court decision on this issue. But it is important to know that even though the Supreme Court has ruled, that does not mean that we've heard the last of this issue.